You can change the world. Learn from proven change makers from all walks of life. They'll show you how to raise money, invest for impact, and so much more. You can start small. Start today and never quit. You can change the world by strengthening your superpowers. Now, welcome to the Superpowers for Good show. I'm your host, Devin Thorpe. Today we've got Abby Rapoport with us. Abby is the founder and the co-founder and publisher of The Stranger's Guide. She's an amazing human being doing really inspiring work. So stick around. You do not want to miss this episode. Abby, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We're thrilled to have you.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you. Abby, tell us about The Stranger's Guide.
So, Stranger's Guide is a publication that I started with my co-founder Kirit Brunner-Dawn, and it really came out of 2016. So, I'm by training a political reporter. I was always excited by journalism. I love talking to people, getting to ask impertinent questions and tell their stories. But as I sort of entered that work and kind of was, doing journalism, what I realized was that the business models were a huge problem. So I got really interested in what are sustainable models for journalism? What are ways that we can continue to do this like vital work, what I consider to be really vital work for communities, for understanding, people who are different than us, understanding new perspectives. How can we do that in a way that's sustainable? And then I'd been doing, so I was a political reporter doing that work. Then I got more interested in the business side and started doing some work as a publisher, sitting on some boards of publications. And then 2016 happened. And there was a new sort of call for America first, and a sense I felt that was increasingly concerning that there were sort of good countries and bad countries. There were worthy and unworthy people. Those are ideas that obviously have long roots in our country and in many countries. But those were things that really began to stand out to me. And I felt like there was an obvious role for journalism and there's an obvious role for storytelling. So I started talking to a friend who I, always sort of brainstormed with and sort of had fun dreaming with. And we began to talk about what would it look like to create a publication that was really rooted in this idea of place and the idea of exploring how different places feel to those people who are living there. So taking all the wonderful things, the things that we celebrate about a community, all of the things that we grapple with, the ways that history and power shape that, and then really digging into what all of those big global themes mean for daily life. What does it mean for the individual who's, going to work, taking their kids to school, making dinner, what have you. And so that was really how we started Stranger's Guide. So fast forward, we launched in 2018. And Stranger's Guide is a quarterly publication that each issue is typically themed around a single location. It's a minimum of 80% writers and photographers from that location, bringing together topics as diverse as sports, history, human rights, LGBTQ rights, and, everything in between. We do music, we do food, but really trying to bring those together so that when we're understanding each of these pieces in the context and get a little bit of what we call a multifaceted portrait of place. So we do that. We've now published 20 issues. Our 21st issue comes out in June, and that issue is actually one that we're doing in partnership and a little bit of a new spin. So I can talk about that later. But each issue has been about, our locations range from places that are traditional travel locations for American travelers to places that are much less accessible. So, in the past, we've done Ireland, we've done Scandinavia, we've done Colombia, we've also done Tehran, we've done Lagos, Nigeria. And with each place, we've gotten extraordinary photographers, extraordinary writers to share their stories and hopefully deliver a little bit of a window into not just a new place, but new people and new perspectives.
Yeah, this is just such vitally important work. I'm fortunate to have been able to visit a lot of those kinds of places, both kinds. I've been to much of Western Europe and
Yeah.
seen all that, and it's it's great and amazing, but it's also wonderful to visit places like rural China and
Wow.
Peshawar, Pakistan, and
Mhm.
rural parts of Uganda. Those
Absolutely.
all over the world, you see different things. And it is interesting. You talked about this idea that we sometimes think about good countries and bad countries. And right now, it's easy to think about Russia bad, Ukraine good, and that's a little bit of an oversimplification, I think, isn't it? We might say that there is a good guy and a bad guy in that conflict, but I've been to Russia many times, and there are great people there, great human beings
Absolutely.
who
I
aren't
think
excited about the war.
absolutely. I mean, well, I mean, the thing that's been strange is when we started this publication, in retrospect, we were hitting the beginning of what turned into a real global rise in authoritarianism and authoritarian tactics. And it's really interesting to consider the ways that those play out in different countries, the way that they're similar and the way that they're different and culturally rooted, right? And historically rooted. And so I think when we look at like any conflict, yeah, there's always a tendency to, it's like we treat global affairs like we treat sports to some degree. Like, well, what team are we rooting for and what team are we against, right? Um, and we sort of take the leader and sort of, okay, that's the coach of the whole team or something, right? It turns out it's not a useful framework in, I would say, in almost any way, right? And so whether or not, and I think I'll say, like, to the degree that our publication has a perspective, where we really value freedom of speech. We believe in people's right to self-expression. And that's really important for us. And so, to be able to do what we do, and we often are working with journalists and writers and photographers in places that don't have access to all of the same rights. So, but beyond that, I mean, I think that when we look at these conflicts, it's just really important to not only use the American frame, right? So when we actually did an issue devoted to Ukraine, and what we really did in that issue was looked at what is modern Ukraine, right? What is it when it's not just, a metaphor for Russian power or a sort of football for NATO to be thinking about, but what are Ukrainians thinking about? How do they see a modern Ukraine identity? What is the role for ethnic Russians in Ukraine? What is the role for ethnic Ukrainians? And sort of hearing those stories, on the one hand, I mean, it make, when you dig in like that, I think you almost always learn something and feel a connection with people. And you also see when things are complicated. So one of my favorite things we did in the Ukraine issue specifically, was on journalism in Ukraine. And there was a pretty extraordinary package that we did that included Laura Secor, who's a editor now at the Atlantic, looked back at sort of the history post Maidan Revolution of journalism and journalists in Ukraine, and that was coupled with a profile of a journalist, Anastasia Stanko, who is grappling with, her country's at war, she's Ukrainian. But part of the role of a journalist is to ask hard questions of your leaders, is to sort of poke a little bit into, like, well, what do we need to be doing differently? What are the problems within our country? And how difficult that is for her right now in Ukraine, right? And how, what is the role of the press in that environment, in a country that's relatively new to democracy, relatively new to, freedom of the press, such as it is. And so I think you're totally right. There's certainly good forces and bad forces. I'm certainly not a moral relativist myself, but I do think, everything's complicated, and it's rare that there's ever an obvious good thing and bad thing. And there's certainly, when you look at countries, every country, contains multitudes, and that's, I think, a critical way to understand it.
Yeah, yeah, it was fascinating. I lived in China for a year, and it's just amazing to sort of get to know people in that place and appreciate how much they are like us,
Mhm.
focused every day on family and the issues that we care about, they care about, and yeah, they live under a totalitarian government. They've kind of figured that out,
Yeah.
and they cope and
Mhm.
1.3 billion of them figure out how to get up every day, eat, go to bed, and thrive in so many ways. So
And I
it's
think
fascinating.
what I've liked, that I think with Strangers Guys a little bit unusual is there's often I think there are ones where it's sort of like, everyone, they're just like us, right? And us, we try to, like, unpack that because we are an international magazine. We have readers from all over the world. We have, contributors from all over the world. So, so us is a broad term, A. But B, I also think, it's really important to look at difference, right? People have a lot of people have very different worldviews and very different understandings of predictability and certainty is an extremely powerful thing, and there's no reason to dismiss that, right? And so for a lot of people in different parts of the world, that the value of maybe I have fewer rights, but I know what's happening next. I'm not living in chaos, right? That's a valid worldview, even if it's maybe one that I grapple with. And I think that creating space to both see, let's use lenses that are important across cultures, right? Like almost every culture loves to eat and has foods that they care about. Every community, has like sports, makes music. I mean, these are universal concepts, and yet the particulars, the way they diverge, the way that conflicts play out within a community is really different and culturally informed. And so, trying to offer that as well is something that I've really personally feel like I've benefited from as I've gotten to do this work.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think through this. It's just invaluable to be able to get a perspective on a place for relatively few dollars, that as opposed to spending thousands upon thousands to visit.
Yeah.
So it's an invaluable service you're providing to
One thing I
people.
would love to just add to that I think we try to do, and thank you for those kind words. And I think it is a really special thing. And, the joke is, this saves you an airline ticket. Though we all, we want people to explore places, but not every place is accessible for so many different reasons. And also your experience when you go somewhere as a traveler is just inherently going to be different. In fact, our name Stranger's Guide comes from the original guidebooks from the like pre kind of 19th century, before travel was really the norm, and people would write their own individual guides to places that were very idiosyncratic and sort of informed by the particular interests of the writer. And so we try to kind of take that view. This is a way to see the parts of a community that you're just not necessarily gonna enter into, if you're not of it and part of that community. The other thing though that I was gonna say when you're talking about sort of the service is that we also really emphasize being something beautiful that isn't always typical. I come from political media and alternative presses and places where it's sort of like put it on some newsprint and send it out. And it was really important to us, especially as we were talking about very different parts of the world with obviously very different histories of colonialism and bias and all sorts of issues, that when we went to tell these stories, that each copy of the magazine would be something beautiful that people would want to hold on to and save and linger over and come back to again and again. And so that's something I really am proud of about Stranger's Guide is they're huge photo essays. There's beauty. The paper itself is thick and lovely, and it's hopefully an object that people want to kind of read in their spare time, so that when we're doing this work, which I feel like is highly mission driven, it's really hard because it's so mission focused, but that it's also something people enjoy, and that they're not sort of thinking, well, this is my do-gooder time reading these stories. No, these are things that we hopefully are luring you to and want you to sort of dive into.
Yeah, it's great work that you're doing, and I'm excited to share more with the audience here. Folks, I'm here with Abby Rapoport today. Abby is the co-founder and publisher of Stranger's Guide. It's an amazing publication about places, deep publication. When we come back after this break, we're going to talk to Abby about her superpower. You don't want to miss this, so stick around.
You can get in on the ground floor to help fix the climate crisis for as little as $100. Pause now to scan the QR code to get started, or visit s4g.biz/raisegreen. You can be a green at Raise Green.
Want to learn from the world's great change makers? Find your superpower. Subscribe to the Superpowers for Good newsletter at superpowersforgood.com. Make your strengths into superpowers that will change the world. Join the super crowd today. Superpowers4good.com.
Hope to raise money from the impact crowd. Good investors are as interested in community, social or environmental impact as you. Connect with Funding Hope, an SEC-registered FINRA member crowdfunding portal to learn how to raise capital from the impact crowd. Scan the QR code now.
Welcome back, everyone. We're so excited to be here today with Abby Rapoport. She is the co-founder and publisher of Stranger's Guide. And now we're going to shift gears and talk to her about her superpower. Abby, you've done some amazing things. I picture you as a reporter, covering politics in Texas, and what a challenging place to cover politics. Oh my gosh. Has there ever been a disagreement in Texas politics?
Never.
Everybody just gets along,
everyone
right?
just goes along to get along. Don't worry about it.
Oh my gosh. So what important work. But what you're doing now, I think, is just such an important part of the world for us to have that deep perspective into human beings and the places they live around the world. But as you think about the great work that you do and the things you've accomplished in your career, what do you see as your superpower?
So funny when you asked me this, I was really struggling because it wasn't something I'd really thought a ton about until you asked me this question in preparing for coming on today. And I think for me, I think that I really I've always been drawn to challenging topics and sort of trying to dig in to what are the problems that feel intractable, and what are the ways that you can find multi-layered solutions, because they require multi-layered solutions. And for me, having spent the last, I guess now almost 20 years in journalism, wearing different hats, I feel like bringing an ecosystems approach of really trying to look at a community, whether that community is a local community or a professional community, and trying to figure out what are the roles each of us can play, and helping other people find the roles they can play to kind of move forward in a group setting, whether that's at a smaller level or in different contexts.
Yeah, I think that
Not
is
as good as flying, I will admit.
That's a great superpower. It's a great superpower. Can you think of an example of a time when you used that to overcome a problem or accomplish something you're proud of?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I think that's a thing I love doing in all sorts of different parts of my life, right? Like whether it's in community work and volunteering, or it's in professional work with Stranger's Guide. So with Stranger's Guide, what I would say is that we're a small independent publication in a time when almost no models of journalism work sustainably all the time, right? There's sort of you're always a little bit like, okay, this engine is working for now, but we've got to find some other, think creatively to find other revenue lines all the time. And so in that context, things like partnerships are critical, and sort of finding ways to go to other publications, other places that do different things, bring different skill sets, whether that's an emphasis on investigative work, or they command a broader e-commerce website where they're able to reach more, do more kinds of commerce, and bring them together to say, okay, we have a project on this place. Can we make a plan that we're gonna, you're gonna do this piece and I'm gonna do this piece? And so an example of that, actually, that I was really pleased with was with the Ukraine guide. With Ukraine, we were able to partner. We knew we wanted to partner with different groups because it was obviously a intense time. And so that issue includes a few really exciting things. Impact Justice, which is a criminal justice reform group based in California, ended up sponsoring for us a series that we ran on incarceration experiences in different parts of the world. So almost every community in the world has incarceration as a part of its state, and those are valid experiences that we want to hear about, even though they're usually kept very separate from the rest of the community. They tell you a lot about how a community sees itself. And so Impact Justice came to us and said, all right, we're going to help you do this even in Ukraine right now. And that story is a really powerful piece about a prison in Ukraine and the experience of the warden and of these mothers who live there with their children. And what it was like to be there under wartime. So we were able to do that because of Impact Justice. Then we also knew we really wanted to work with displaced people and people who are experiencing either, leaving the country as refugees or displaced within Ukraine. And so we were able to go to Alight, which is an amazing organization that does work on resettlement and refugee issues. And they worked with us to connect us to artists. They had put out a call to Ukrainian artists, and we were able to publish all of this work from these Ukrainian artists through that partnership. And then we build together for every issue advisory boards, which bring together academics, business owners, policy people, and artists and creatives, and we try to help them all identify we try to go to them and ask them to help us identify what are the themes and topics that we need to be tackling. And so for Ukraine, we were able to do that as well, have that conversation with those different experts. And so for me, when all of that can come together, it creates something that's so much greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, that is so profoundly important, and I just love it. As you think about your experience and the things you've done and accomplished with this superpower of yours, how would you coach someone to develop some of that ability? I realize you've honed that, whether it was accidentally or on purpose, over years. But how would you coach people to sort of lean in to become more like you?
To do more like ecosystem building, I think, I think a couple of things. I mean, one is especially when I work with like younger people, I really encourage them to get involved in their community, like wherever they are. I think one of the challenges we have right now as a country in the US is that like we're not interacting enough with people we live near. We tend to do a lot of our interaction online or in professional contexts. So finding local opportunities to interact with people with whom you have nothing in common except that you live in the same place can be tremendously powerful in terms of building muscles of just listening, hearing where other people are, and then figuring out what are the opportunities for synergy, where are the opportunities to work together, whether that's, hey, we both get to know each other, like reading at the public library with kids, and then we discover that maybe we should do a bake sale together for the library, right? Like having opportunities where you're interacting with someone who's really different, and then seeing what are the skills we bring, what are the assets we bring to delve into something can be used at so many different levels. So that's one of the places where I really start. And then the other two things that I think are journalism is really good training for, but you certainly don't have to be a journalism, is really like listening and asking questions of other people. I think, again, because I think we don't interact with enough people who are different than us and all manner of things. I mean, just like voted differently than us, right? It gets really, it can feel really uncomfortable to sort of sit with someone where you, hey, I think we disagree. I bet we really have different values. I don't even know what I would say to them, but sometimes when you can start really having conversations and really listening, it can really help to just break some of that down. And that doesn't mean you can't have vehement disagreements, and even, moral disagreements. But it does, I think, find ways to then see, okay, we may disagree on all of these different things, but here are places where we can move a community, or these are places where we can bring together other people to just break down what I feel like polarization threatens in so many different contexts.
Yeah, it's great insights. I really appreciate you sharing that. As we wrap up here, I wonder if you'd take a minute and tell people how they can learn more about you, how they can subscribe to the newsletter, how they can subscribe to the publication, how they can follow you on social media,
I would
connect with you
love to do
personally.
that.
Share the whole story.
Yes, there are so many ways to connect with Strangers Guide. So we have, like I said, we have a print publication. People can go to strangersguide.com to look at our work. If you look to the top right-hand corner, you can subscribe. You can also look at single issues on our store, which is shop.strangersguide.com. Or again, you can go to the site and link from there. But you can buy single issues. You can subscribe, which is really the best way to support us. And you can also sign up for our Substack, which is strangersguide.substack.com, where we do several newsletters, including a Sunday one that I send out with just sort of my thoughts on a different long form piece each week. But those are three key ways. You can also give it makes a great gift, I will say, for the people who have everything. Coffee table worthy publications about different places can be a way to, get high on the Christmas list.
It's a brilliant idea. I've just added that to my giving list for this Christmas. So thank you so much. Abby, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. We really appreciate you and wish you every success in the great work you're doing.
It's an honor to be here, and I love the Superpowers for Good community, and so I'm honored to get to talk with all of them.
All righty. Thank you. Let's do some good.